Welcome to episode 3 of Panic at the Discourse. My name is Edwin Kempatchell. We're here on the land of the Kaurna people in Adelaide, South Australia. I want to introduce firstly the panelists that we have. PJ Rose, welcome, thank you for coming.
Pleasure.
Ben Brooker.
Hello.
And Jules Nixon.
Hey.
So this project is exploring arts discourse in a digital age. It's the third episode that we've done. The first was a kind of a welcome, introductions, bit of a conversation. The second one was our first review episode, and we talked about Grief Lightning, which was a production at Rumpus. And today we're talking about Antigone, the recent State Theatre Company production. Before we do, though, I want to just have a bit of a chat about reflections so far, and for you to introduce yourself a bit more and to give any information that you feel like might be useful before we go into the review. So maybe to start with, Jules, what was it like for you in terms of, moving from you're a actor, a filmmaker, now a social work student as well, but you haven't had that hat of a reviewer or a critic. What's that like doing this project and wearing that different hat?
Yeah, I find it really exposing in a way that making art doesn't make me feel, which is weird, because this is really what I really think. And I think I do have that safety of someone that isn't really auditioning or working with very mainstream people. And I have the safety of, I have my social work career that I'm doing. But yeah, exposing, I think, would be the right word. But at the same time, safe, because I have these great people here to support me and encourage me in my freedom to express how I feel.
I'm wondering, can I ask Jules, in terms of responsibility, do you feel a responsibility to kind of anyone except yourself in terms of the views that you're putting forwards here? Or do you feel responsibility to industry in any way or any other groups of people?
No.
Right. Good answer.
I can't, all I can say is what I think, I can't, and it's also who am I can't put the world on my shoulders like that. I'm just one individual human, as we all are. I do think that, yes, there's pressure as like a woman or whatever to speak for women, but I think you just ignore that and go, well, no, I can't, so yeah.
Which will be interesting to get into, I think, once we kind of really go into the work today.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting that you use the word exposing because, so I had a conversation with Mary Angley, who's the performer of Grief Lightning, and I was like, well, what was that like having your work discussed by people? And she said exactly that same thing of it felt exposing, which I think was for her as well, this idea of having her performance discussed in a very public internet-based space. And I think to me, that's one of the really kind of scary, nerve-wracking things about this project is that it's very exposed. Like, we're very exposed. If we fuck up, it's apparent, and we're doing it while we're talking about other people's work, where it's like, that whole thing of people in glass houses shouldn't throw rocks, that it's like, yeah, it feels exposing to be talking about other people because it's like, well, what are they going to say back to us? And how, are they going to judge us for judging them? Or, yeah.
Does it feel so exposing because it's on the internet?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's, these episodes are pretty unedited. It's not like we're rehearsing it. It's an organic conversation. And, yeah, I think it's on the internet, and it's also, I think, because it's self-produced. It's not like we've gone to a TV studio or a radio station and they've invited us on and they've set a structure and we've got the 8 minutes and they ask the questions and we respond. It's kind of like, this is what we've created and we're to blame if it's not good, or like it's what we've created.
I think one interesting thing this has thrown up for me, which I've been thinking quite a bit about, and I think it's interesting in terms of this episode because, we'll be looking at a main stage company's theatre work as against Mary's work, which is very kind of small scale, independent by comparison. I think is I think there's an interesting open question around how we might approach work that's that different, in a way that does justice and takes each of those works seriously, but accounts for those different levels. Someone who's working in a very different kind of independent space, more or less as a solo artist, as against something like the State Theatre Company of SA, which has, comparatively, big resources at its disposal. So I guess I'm just flagging that as something that I'm interested in maybe unpacking as we go, because I think it's worth talking about.
And even more so because, our next episode is going to be on Midsummer Night's Dream, which was presented by National Theatre Live, and so that's even yeah.
But which no one here has seen live, right?
No. And I think also there's just this kind of huge contrast between the idea of theatre being a hyper-local, immediate kind of thing, and the internet being the opposite of that. That it's like, how do you marry these two things of online discussion and theatre that, aside from things like National Theatre Live, theatre you have to be there.
Right.
Yeah, and I think there's a safety in theatre. Like, I think with this, any, Johnny from Germany can, comment on and go, what is this crap? Who, what terrible speakers? There's this thing that it's we're completely exposed and anyone and everyone can say stuff. But that's good. I think we're ready for that, and that's why we've done it.
Yeah.
But I think there's people who are actually really scared to publicly say it. I was talking to you guys about this person that I spoke to who still has this, I can't believe you're saying, publicly what you really think about these productions, because they're actors and they want to work in this industry. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's the whole system encourages people to praise each other's work publicly, and but also you get this kind of social credit for private conversations that are very critical. But yeah, so it's a really interesting thing of how do we not fall into that trap of let's just say the things that people are going to want to hear, and when we say them, then they're going to be more likely to share them on social media. So, that encourages us to be more positive. That's the kind of system creating a feedback loop of
and
positive
I think of that as boosterism. So that's kind of my term for it. It's not mine, but I came across it somewhere, and I think it's really useful because I think it describes this problem. And you and I, Ed, had a bit of an interesting exchange before this podcast around, in some ways, for example, the difference between critiquing, let's say, a mainstream Hollywood film and a local independent theatre production. There's, in a way, a vested interest, I think, when you're reviewing local theatre, and partly there's this kind of telegraphing of identity that's involved with that. It's about saying, I'm a theatre person, I love theatre, and therefore I'm going to love this show. And at the same time, there's this sense of, you often hear people say, it's really important to support local independent artists. So that's something that only really trucks with things like theatre or kind of local music scenes. It's not something that you're going to think about if you're critiquing the latest Marvel film. They don't need you to boost that film. It's going to do that by itself. And, people often describe those films as critic proof, in the sense that it doesn't matter what a critic film says about the latest superhero movie. It's going to do what it does at the box office. And so I think that's something that plays into these conversations that we're having. It's how do you have robust critical conversations about work that are constructive at the same time? And I think you can define constructive in various different ways. I think it's not necessarily about getting people to go and see shows that you think are perhaps substandard. Maybe it's about, I would hope that Mary, might have derived something of use from the conversation that we had that she could take forwards into the work that she's going to do. I mean, I don't think as a critic you can put too much store in that, but I think it's worth thinking about the use that these kinds of conversations can have that can be constructive and can influence the work that's being made.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because you don't want to just be mean. And because I'm not any longer intimately involved in the community, right? I'm an audience member now. I mean, I used to be a director. I used to be a tutor. I used to do lots of things, but these days I'm a passionate audience member. So I don't have a pulse of what's actually happening inside anywhere, like I used to when I was teaching or directing or moving about. So,
which I think is also what makes you perfect for it. You know, like that you have that background, and now you're like a professional audience goer. You know, like you seem to see everything, and often twice. So which is, you know, remarkable. And so you used to run a women's theatre company, is that right?
In the States, yes, I ran. It was the only women's theater company in the States who had its own space. I mean, we had our own floor of a community center, so we had a theater space and workshop space.
Which state in?
Minnesota, yeah. Minneapolis, Twin Cities. So I'm quite keen to, and I was very keen to see what was done with the story, the Antigone story, because I don't know why I've always been so attracted to the Greek stories. When you think back, right? So I mean, imagine we're on the beach in the amphitheater in Athens, right? And the play actually starts down the beach with the bonfires heralding the return of Agamemnon from the Trojan Wars, right? But I've always been intrigued by how extraordinary that they created this theater, that the Greeks created this theater from small rural rituals into this amazing experience for an audience, you know. Anyway, that's why I love these old plays, because they're cause for great spectacle, but meaningful spectacle.
Well, I'm curious how this, you know, production of Antigone compared.
Like PJ, I mean, I think these Greek tragedies primarily have endured for a reason, and I think they do encapsulate, I think, all of the sort of marvel and mystery and grandeur and wonder of theatre. And so I'm not surprised that we're still engaging with them in the 21st century. And I think it's, you know, it's worth saying straight up, so that this production, which is a state theatre company of SA production, as we've mentioned, by Elena Carapetis, who for a long time was known primarily as an actor, and I think in the last kind of 10 or so years has really moved more and more into playwriting. And I can remember actually her first play, The Good Son, which was an independent production that was done here, which I think was, I remember it being a really impressive debut about a kind of contemporary Greek family. Eleanor, of course, has Greek ancestry herself, which arguably positions her very well to kind of, you know, take on, I guess, one of the canonical Greek plays by Sophocles, as PJ's mentioned. And it, you know, the story of Antigone has been reinterpreted many times down the years. There's a 1940s version, which I really love, by French playwright Jean Anouilh, which in its time was kind of a response to the Nazi occupation of Paris. So it is a play, I think, that historically, you know, withstands, you know, reinterpretation really well. And so that's what this is. This is kind of described as a response to Antigone, and there's not a lot of the original play, you would have to say, that kind of makes it into this response. I think it kind of starts there, and it goes to many other places, which I think we'll talk about. But, you know, it's in terms of the publicity and the way that this show has been sold, is that it's very much within, I suppose, the spectrum of, what would you call it, kind of post-Me Too feminism. very much using that kind of language of empowerment. And it's interesting, I think, from that point of view, that it goes to Antigone and attempts this kind of feminist revisionist take on it, because in some ways I think you could say that Antigone, it is almost a proto-feminist work in some ways, because it has obviously the title character is what we would now call a kick-ass female, like a strong female protagonist in many ways. She's someone who stands up against Creon, the police state, PJ, that you've already talked about, trying to bury her dead brother, which the state decrees that she cannot do on pain of death. And so that's kind of the wonderfully kind of, tragic high stakes that this play kind of starts with.
So it was presented by State Theatre Company of South Australia. The writer is Elena Carapetis, director Anthony Nicola. Meg Wilson was set and costume designer, lighting designer Gavin Norris, sound design Jason Sweeney. Performers were Catherine Adams, Chiara Gabrielli, Mark Saturno, and Kadan Zeliki. In the last two performances, that Elena Carapetis was on stage to replace one character, and the assistant director Jennifer Stephanadis was also on stage to replace another character because of COVID.
Right.
So one of the things to say about this episode and the way that we're structuring Panic at the Discourse is very much the intention is to include footage of the productions, to have these episodes as a kind of media-rich experience for people that are either watching on YouTube or even just listening to the podcast, to have those excerpts of the performance. State Theatre Company, have been very open to discussing how we can kind of make this work, and so we've been in conversation about using the footage, and then COVID happened, and it meant that it happened on the night that they were going to record the full recording, and so what we have now is the archival footage that was taken on preview.
So they didn't record Elena in it?
No, and they didn't record it they record things at quite high production standards now. They have an in-house videographer, which is actually surprisingly quite new. They never used to. It was always like an iPhone at the back of the theatre, and now they have proper tour pack productions. Just a bit of a disclaimer that it's both a preview performance, which is unideal, and it's also essentially an archival recording.
You admit you did it.
I don't deny it.
You knew it was illegal.
Yes, you said so in your speeches.
And you did it anyway.
Allegedly.
I was very clear.
You were.
No one was to bury him.
Apparently.
You heard me say that.
Several times.
And yet you buried him. You buried Polynices.
I don't deny it.
He started a war. Traitors get no burial. Now, I thought anarchists were trying to take over. And they dragged you in front of me. Do you have anything to say for yourself?
So, from memory, that's the first scene, but it doesn't open with that. It opens with this very long excerpt from a Greek language, black and white version of the Sophocles play. I would love to hear if anyone was able to work out why it opened in that way, because for the life of me, I
just assumed she was giving it context, that this is, and it was with Irene Pappas, some phenomenal traditional Greek film actor. Right. So I just thought it, and gave us an opportunity to hear the language of what it would have been. So I was very grateful for that opening, because, there are odd writers and filmmakers like Paolo Pasolini, who did a lot of filming of operatic events. So I was thrilled to be able to see what it might have been, or what a Greek audience might have experienced.
Right.
And it must be a famous film.
Yeah.
I assume also it's because it was framing the performance as a reflection on Antigone as opposed to as Antigone itself. So we all watch the film and then we're reflecting on it. So it was kind of framing it like that, I think.
Yeah. I just felt like there was a lot of it. I don't know how long that excerpt was, and I think I became kind of enchanted by watching it, because it's such a beautifully shot film. And it actually, you mentioned Pasolini. It reminded me of that kind of school of European filmmaking, and I kind of got lost in it. And then I was, talking about digital theatre, I think that was such a kind of mediated way of starting this play, and then it goes into that opening scene, which I think that's the scene that I think in a way encapsulates the story of Antigone, and then I think out of that first scene it goes to many other different places. But I think it felt like a little bit of a false steer for me at the beginning. I think that was my experience.
It was 3.5 minutes, which is quite a long time for
Yep.
a piece of film in theatre.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in this structure that, like, this production reminded me of our third year production at drama school was called Trojan Barbie, and I cannot remember the playwright's name for the life of me, I'm sorry. But it was like this, I think, a response to this, epic, story of the Trojan War, and sort of framing it with all of these, the female protagonists having the lead stories. And even just tonally, like, some of the language, like, I still have flashbacks to playing Hecuba and just bellowing in this drama room of my babies, all of my babies, and crying with Antoine, who played Andromache, and we like wept together, and we were like, we're so tired, and Rosalba's like, weep, keep weeping. I'm like, how much longer? So it's interesting to have that, like, thing that is quite enchanting, that cadence, that feeling of the Greek story, and how it balances tonally with this very postmodern, very subverted, structure of a feminist, piece of theatre. And I'm interested to see how you guys responded to that, because I feel like that's what you're talking about, right? That juxtaposition of that classical meets the modern.
Yes, it is very postmodern. It's very deconstructed. It reminded me a little bit of some of Ivo van Hove's work, particularly the Roman tragedies. I think the way that I think it kind of compacted that kind of grand Greek tradition of storytelling, I think felt similar, and also how kind of mediated it was in that sense that I've already mentioned. I wondered if something was being set up aesthetically with that early black and white film. I thought we were going to get some kind of like smash cut to something really colorful and noisy, but that actually isn't what happens.
That's right. That didn't happen.
Yeah.
I was totally moved by the whole production. Now, part of that is because I used to work in women's theater and was very engaged in the 70s, the early 70s, with all of those new things that were happening for women. So I was primed to be open to whatever was happening. But I also was primed to whatever was happening with women's politics, because I was a girl and I grew up in the middle of all that shit. And I cannot tell you, I probably don't need to tell you, but it was to have those things mentioned in public was such a relief. To have people name the chronic abuse of female gendered people's self-esteem. And there's no other way to talk about it except that it is chronic abuse of self-esteem. So it's very hard. And that would be true, which is, as a feminist, it was totally possible to get what was called the umbrella of oppressions. I get why there shouldn't be a white director of an African-American play, because I would be so livid if there was a man directing a feminist production in our company. I wouldn't let it happen. Do you know what? Now, that may sound prejudiced and biased, but it's true. It's about the lived experience that can't necessarily be articulated regularly.
But then this production had a male director. Did that?
Yes, but the theater I was involved with were making.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I totally know what you mean. It's just, I was on board for whatever they were doing. There's obviously, like, you know, some structural things, some flashbacks to drama school aside. I think that I really, I found those things radical and moving in a way that I think that if you're a male feminist and you experience feminism intellectually and you go, well, I agree with that, I'm on board with this, I get it. I think that it's easier for you to find those criticisms and to maybe not be as moved. But I think, I don't know, it's hard to say that it's just because you're a woman. It does affect you. Like, I was talking to Ed before about the social work that I'm doing, and I've just been working for the last 3 weeks with women, a group of women who've been affected by domestic violence, and some of the worst things you can imagine. And I was at the point of tears at some point in this play. And some men might not have been emotionally taken there, but those moments were profound for me. And I think we shouldn't take for granted how radical and amazing it is to hear those words on stage. Like, I think in the arts, we have a very homogenous way of thinking. We're all progressive, we're all lefties, we all get it, right? But, you know, Johnny from Germany or whoever else is in the crowd who doesn't experience theatre, doesn't have these discussions, this is radical for them to hear and to see Chiara bending over and pretending to be fucked on stage and to hear those statistics and to be taken on that journey. I think we shouldn't take it for granted that it's old for us. It's over. It's not. It's for people who aren't the subscriber base or us, seeing that show would have been, I think, pretty profound.
And theater is not just information, right? So it doesn't work for me to say, oh yeah, we know all that. That's the difference of the lived experience and the theory of it, right? It's still there. So I want to honor the production and the playwright and all the actors, because for those of us for whom it worked, it was a really important production. I have a lot of room for it. And I loved the use of and of course it's been done before, the use of the multimedia stuff. One of my favorite slides was quoting Greta Thunberg, blah, blah, blah. Right? What a great quote from her. What else? So she's kind of acknowledging, yeah, we've said this before, we know, at the same time. Yes, it made me extremely sympathetic with all my work in the 70s and 80s with women's stuff, sympathetic with any identity politics. I worked for a long time just as a colleague with a Native American theater in New York City called Spider Women. And I would bring them to Minneapolis because there's a large Native community in Minneapolis and St. Paul as well. And they were, for example, one of the plays they created was called Exotic, Neurotic, anyways, and it was about, they did this, they just got people from the community, women, Native women, or any woman of color. Actually, there was a white critic in Minneapolis who talked about the casting, because we kept trying to bring in other points of view about the non-white women in the cast. So when he came up to visit our company in the office, I said, excuse me, everybody, this is Peter. He's a non-woman. And that helped him change that vocabulary, but it's made me very sympathetic with every group's identity struggle to be recognized and acknowledged as valid. And it's great in this city because we do have lots of crossover.
I don't feel like I don't want to be reviewing shows generally in this kind of project because my role is different, but also this one, I couldn't get to see it live. I only watched the archival recording, so I don't feel like I'm in a good position to properly review it. But what's really interesting is the conversations that I've had, the response seems very gendered, that when I've spoken to women who have seen it, they've enjoyed it, and when I've spoken to the men that have seen it, they haven't enjoyed it. And that's kind of super interesting, and also I think fairly unusual, because there is feminist work that has been put on that has had a pretty broad appeal to all people, and this production seems unusually, I don't want to say, maybe not divisive, but unusually gendered in its response, which is interesting because it's not, I don't think it's as if men in Adelaide or, men that I've spoken to don't want to see feminist theatre. There's something about this production that, for the men that I've spoken to, has not appealed to them.
Yeah, I mean, as the man on the couch, I feel it's incumbent on me to say something about that. I mean, I agree. That has also been my impression of this work, and actually what you've just said, Edward, in terms of that gendered reaction, that certainly fits with my experience of this work and speaking to female identifying people who saw it and, for the most part, got a lot out of it. And it's interesting because it seems like a lot of those people were able, I think, as I was, to kind of identify, structural problems with the work, for example, but were more able than I was, I think, to see through them to something more core, more fundamental in this work that I think Jules acknowledged. And I sort of want to preface everything I say from this point by saying that I acknowledge absolutely what Jules and PJ have just said in terms of what it meant for a lot of people, again, a lot of female identifying people, I suspect, to hear these things said out loud on stage within that context. There was obviously a great power in that. And I think it's incumbent on me to acknowledge that. And also just, so the performance that I attended, there was a group of, I assume kind of like a girls' high school group had been taken to see it. And I do remember kind of sitting in the audience thinking, well, I wonder what they'll go away and make of this. And for them, again, this might have been a really important experience. And, I'm not someone who's sitting there thinking that this work is being made for 37-year-old men, because I don't think it is. I think this work is being made for a much more specific audience that doesn't look like me, and I think that's totally fine. And when I say somebody doesn't look like me, I mean I was going to say it should go without saying, perhaps it doesn't, but I suspect that politically, in terms of feminism, I think we're probably all on the same page in this room. So I think it's kind of worth saying that. But I think maybe the difference is, PJ, as you were intimating, in that in that sense of a lived experience. And I think that enables people to engage or respond or interact with this work in a different way than I was able to. And that perhaps other male identifying people struggle to as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for acknowledging that. It's easy to have forgotten, though, what the ordinary reality has meant to people who are on the bottom in that system. And that's what's from thank God, that's right. We have to keep saying these things out loud, because what I wrote down was, it's so obvious that non-women don't notice or give it any import, because it's so obvious. And that's one of the things I liked about the script and the production, was it made the obvious, it shoved it in our face. Yes, it is obvious, and could make me so angry all over again, Take up some of this.
Well, I was just going to add, I wrote down a quote that whoever Chiara was playing said, "Whatever is everywhere becomes invisible." And that just really has stuck with me. And I think it's really hard to communicate. And, I think, I can completely concur on structural stuff. But it's not just that it's obvious. It's just that it's exhausting. And, I also want to acknowledge, my own, just huge amounts of privilege, as, the kind of woman that I identify, and being white and all that. But I do think that we take a lot of things for granted. So I don't think the anger and the obviousness is too much, because I really don't want to go down this road, because it's like super triggering, but the whole Johnny Depp, Amber Heard thing, whatever you think, just the whole spectacle of having a domestic violence issue being put on the front stage and being argued and made memes about, and like, lol, isn't this all hilarious? I think that trivialization of that is going to ramp up, and we're not going to notice it. And so I think things like this, women kind of screaming like, fucking listen for a second, is actually important. And for people not to get complacent. Again, I don't know how much that's going to affect a male identifying person's enjoyment of the show, but again, I don't think all theatre has to be enjoyed.
And I think that context you mentioned is important, because I think any play like this, which has it has a ripped from the headlines quality to a lot of it. And I think any play that has that, your experience of it is going to be coloured by what's happening at the time. And you mentioned the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, which I think that was in the back of my head as I was watching this, and also the recent school shooting in the US, because one of the longest scenes in the show is, I don't know about you guys, but it felt like it sat slightly outside of the rest of the work in a way. It almost felt like it was kind of struggling to be its own play in a way. That scene where I think it's a politician or a gun advocate is taken hostage, and is kind of forced by a woman to enact gun control change or legislation, and yeah, that was an interesting. I thought that was an interesting scene, and I think Eleanor's writing at the scene level is really good, and that's something that I did want to acknowledge, and I think it's good in that scene, and it's really good in I think it's that Catherine Adams monologue that is maybe the third scene perhaps, where she's playing a kind of school-aged girl, and she's kind of and then now the liberatory aspect of this I can totally understand, because I felt it myself when she's on stage and in that, I think she's in a school uniform and she's spouting all these obscenities. And she was drooling at the end of it, and it was a wonderfully impassioned performance of a really good monologue. I thought as a standalone piece of writing that was sensational. And I think there are a number of scenes like that through it. But I think my problem, and I don't think I was the only person who felt this, was that dramaturgically none of it made sense to me. It felt like a series of cobbled together vignettes with no through line, and that's what I really struggled to.
But they all
transcend.
had the same theme. They all had the exact same action.
Sure.
Every single one of them.
Right. And that goes to your point, PJ, about you said something like just talking about the way that this play in a way repackages the obvious, or however you put it, or it shoves it in your face, I think you said. I feel like I'm kind of allergic to that as an audience member. And you and I, Ed, have spoken about didactic theatre, and you said that you had quite a high tolerance for didactic theatre. I've got a very low tolerance for it. I don't like being told what to think. My favourite kinds of theatre experiences are when I might not even be sure what I'm thinking while I'm watching it, but then in the days and weeks afterwards, things will percolate and I'll maybe gain a different sense of what I've just watched, or I will leave with questions that I'm not able to resolve. And I think whatever you made of Antigone, I don't think you could say that about it. There is no subtext in this work. It is all surface. It's all shouting all the time, or at least that was my experience of it.
I guess it comes down to whether you like that or not. And I suppose I have a lot of time for that because I don't think there's any question or any grey area about it. But again, that's my opinion about it, you know?
Yeah. Can we watch another excerpt?
Absolutely.
While I think men and women are equal, they are also different. And I think it's inevitable, and I don't think it's a bad thing at all, that we always have, say, more women doing things like physiotherapy, and an enormous number of women simply doing housework. I think it would be folly to think that women will ever dominate or even approach equal representation in a large number of areas simply because their abilities, their aptitudes and interests are different for physiological reasons.
Imagine poor old Julia Gillard having to live in the same parliament as him. Yeah. God, she must have been such... So don't you love it when they show that the building of that, when she finally comes in and goes... Sorry, I'm changing plays here.
No, I love it. Yeah, it's just interesting though, because I think one thing that stuck out for me was one of those media things. Someone said something about, oh, don't be alone in a room with X person. he's fine if you just don't be alone with him.
Which apparently was something that was said to one of the cast members.
Said about someone. This line has been said about people tied to this production.
Right.
That kind of alarmed me and made me feel like, and again, I'm not like pointing fingers or anything, but I think there's a safety even within this like very educated, like I'm on board male feminist kind of theatre guy who thinks that they're sort of immune to the kind of sexism that we're talking about here. Whether it's like mental labor of division of labor in like a housemate situation, or in a production where there's like a lot of dudes who are like totally cool but actually are super creepy, and you know, we like to pretend it's not in our sphere, but it's just hidden. And that's why I think the screaming of this and the brazenness is actually quite profound for me, and might not hit home for guys who go, well, I don't do any of that. What are they talking about? They're talking about this feminism we've all been going on about.
Forever.
Shut up.
I happen to have that line kind of ready if it's... I'll just play that section.
Sure.
But things are different now. They'd never get away with it.
Just never be alone with him behind a closed door and you'll be fine.
To me, I think it's a really interesting question about the role of political theatre in terms of is the role of political theatre to change people or change people's minds, or can the role of political theatre be to just build community and galvanise people that already understand it, but then get emboldened to say, yes, my experience is validated, or, you know, yes, I'm being heard, or whatever it is. It's a really interesting thing of, can you say that political theatre is not... Should all political theatre be targeted at changing people's minds?
I think that's such a great question, because I think we're all in agreement that, in a way, the central kind of dramaturgical impulse or pulse of this play is rage. It's anger. And in a way, I think I can see how that's liberating and gratifying to people, especially who have been on the receiving end of, PJ, what you've already spoken about, and you as well, Jules. But at the same time, with my dramaturg's hat on, I worry that rage or anger, I wonder if there's a kind of nihilistic aspect to that in terms of the way that it can play out in drama. Because I think, Edwin, with this work, that's such an interesting question, because I think, what does Eleanor want us to do or to think about on leaving this work? If she just wants us to be angry, to me that feels insufficient, because it sounds like, from what I've heard in this room, that we were already angry and we know we're angry. But what then is kind of my question. And I'm not sure that
Rearmed. That's how I felt. Rearmed,
right.
Reminded that it is not over. As much as we've done, as much as people's minds understand, we're still in deep shit.
But I know also
It's not the theater's job, though, to tell me what to do. It is the theater's job to move me, to engage me, and it's my issue of what to do with that now. It's not the playwright's job. Do you think?
I think it's the playwright's job to ask questions.
And so the questions have been asked. Didn't you feel that questions were asked?
No, I felt like I didn't feel like I was being engaged in that way by this work.
See, I think that's the gendered difference.
Right.
I feel more, even though I could only see the archival recording, I feel my eyes are more opened by this conversation than I suspect I would have been from actually seeing the production. Like, if I saw the production, walked away and didn't talk to anyone, I think I would have been like, well, what have I learned? I've learned that, these things are in the world, which, I kind of know in a general sense. But what's interesting to me is how much it's affected other people.
Well, I think, I don't know about specific questions, but for me, it raises questions of the whole point of it being a classic reinterpreted as a modern piece, where it goes, to what extent have we really come, or, far in terms of equality for all the genders. And, you know, you can argue, yes, quite a lot, but, and I think it's in that but that we have to go, let's not be so complacent to be like, oh yes, but I had it better than my mother and the people before, to think that it's okay the way that it is, because it's not. And, you know, my own, again, it's that thing of like, should the playwright like hand give you all the questions, or do you go, okay, it did make me think of race and class and ways that, you know, what about these other, you know, facets of being a human that are going to affect people's experiences. Like, you think about what it's like being in modern America in the United States as a poor person with a government that just completely gaslights you and then makes you suck its dick and thank you for fucking you, you know, and then, you know, we kind of have that here, but also it's just
Nicer.
nice, a bit more polite fucking, you know. They like wipe you down after or something. But you know, yeah, maybe it doesn't give you like, okay, well, step one after, like, let's all do this. But I think galvanizing and like strengthening is fine, because sometimes you do forget, even in yourself as a woman who's experienced this and been angered by it. You do have the daily life of just moving along and trying to make pleasant with everyone. And so sometimes you go, fuck, yes, I want to do something in my lifetime to make it better for the next.
So in the original, Antigone is engaged to Creon's son, Haman, right? And in the original, Haman commits suicide, right? So Creon loses not only the battle with Antigone, but he loses his entire family because his wife also commits suicide.
Right.
Which is a pretty shocking result of his action. Is that, do you remember, is that where, remember the statistics about most suicides are committed by men?
Right, something like 70-75%.
Is that where that statistic came up, do you think, in relation to that plot element? Or?
I don't remember that context. I remember that statistic happening in the context of that scene with Mark Saturno, so the only male actor in this production, which I think, Ed, did you want to play a clip of that?
And I asked my friends that exact question, and like me, they answered, "No, mate, I'd never do anything like that." And they meant it, but then they did. All over the world, our failure and our guilt sticks to us, and we keep trying to convince ourselves that it's normal. We pretend, we switch off, we despair, and we medicate, we drink, and we work, and we deny, and we produce, and we keep busy, and we chase, and we fuck, and we hide, and we compete, we disconnect, and we puff up, but we lie, we judge, we hate, we dismiss, and we laugh, because if you don't laugh, you cry, and so we don't cry, and so the tears pierce backwards from our eyes and burrow deep into our brains and detonate when we are all alone, and then we are gone.
God, he's a good actor.
He is good. And again, I would say really nice writing on the line level. That image of the tears traveling backwards from the eyes and exploding in the brain, that stayed with me. Like, I think that's a really beautiful piece of stage writing. But I did walk out of that wondering why that scene was there, because to me it felt slightly tokenistic. And I think as well, I struggled a little bit because I feel like this kind of male suicide thing is a little bit of isn't it an anti-feminist kind of talking point?
No.
I feel like this comes up a lot, but men kill themselves more, but men go to war and die more often than women, so life is actually harder for men. I think this is something that kind of alt-right...
Who gets in these arguments about that kind of stuff?
I'm wondering where you got that idea that feminists don't believe in, or... Yeah, where did you get that idea?
That's used by like Jordan Peterson kind of arguments of it's not that feminists don't believe in that, but he's saying that men work more dangerous jobs and therefore
and more likely to suicide and more likely to die in war. Therefore, it's worse to be a man than a woman. This is a conservative, right wing male talking point that I hear a lot. And this scene made me think of that. So I kind of balked at it a little bit for that reason.
I think it's really easy to take like things like feminism or men's issues and relate them to the loudest, most absurd sort of internet talking point that's happened recently and forget about sort of like what core feminists believe. And I think if you talk and sat face to face with any reasonable woman who was a feminist, they would completely agree with those issues. But I think like it's easy to take these like SJW like sub factions of people and put them against men's right activists and have that be the dialogue, when actually that's just the toxic internet scum of the top of the soup version of whatever's being talked about,
Sure.
Until a couple of weeks ago, I never heard of this guy.
Oh, we're so sorry.
No, it's important to be educated.
I feel like he's become one of the leitmotifs of Panic at the Discourse.
It's interesting that thinking about the production of In the Club, the Patricia Cornelius production, I think 2 years ago, 3 years maybe.
Geordie Brookman directed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So a bit longer than that, which was, I think, probably the worst Patricia Cornelius play that I've seen.
Yes.
I thought it was...
What's it about?
It was at the Odeon, I think.
Yeah, also at the Odeon, yeah.
Directed by Geordie Brookman. It was about kind of sexist and problematic male behaviour in football clubs, a football club. So kind of it came out of that it was very much in the headlines at that time. And it was a bad play, and I think it was poorly directed. I think Geordie was entirely the wrong person to direct that show.
And a really interesting parallel in terms of like State Theatre doing a production about, post Me Too kind of issues in the Odeon, both with a male director. And this one being much more overt in its politics than the other one, which had, larger cast, bigger production, more kind of aesthetic elements, the pool of water and all this kind of, stuff. It was a higher production, but really missed the mark. Yes. Whereas this one is pared back, very overt, very political, and seems to have totally hit the mark. And both directed by men. And I think, as you were saying, one of the really weird things about In the Club was that it did feel like it had a very male lens to the direction, and there was this like gratuitous kind of female dancing with water on, like it was very kind of like, whoa.
There was this incredibly tone-deaf moment at the end where I think kind of the female cast were essentially lined up across the stage and there was water cascading, and it was incredibly sexualizing, and given what had gone before that moment, it was really bizarre. I think this question of lenses is really interesting because it's already come up. PJ, you were talking about this question of who should be directing certain kinds of work, and as Ed, you've just said, this is another male directing a woman's work. In this case, a queer identifying man, which is interesting to me because one of the things that I found myself thinking about this work was that it felt like it was the kind of work that I might have seen 10 or 15 years ago, or perhaps a little longer, in the sense that I don't think it had a real queer lens on it, which surprised me, because I think in many ways, with contemporary theatre that identifies as feminist, it feels like a kind of queer aesthetic or a queer politics almost goes hand in hand with that. And I felt like that was lacking from this work. I wonder what you thought of that.
I would have loved to have no men in the cast, just because I think if you're going to go there and have drag. And I know that the performer Chiara, I know they do drag. Yeah. And I don't know, that would have been kind of amazing. Just next level.
You said that to me when we walked out, and I think you were exactly right. I think you put that idea in my head, and I couldn't shake it, and it did make me wonder why it wasn't an all-female cast with that kind of drag king aspect, especially given that there's someone in that cast, Chiara, who does drag king extremely well.
I'm curious, do you think that, like thinking about one of the biggest limitations and challenges, I think, for state theatre is that they have this subscription model of producing work where they have to do a certain number of productions each year. When they do new work, they're creating it in a much shorter time frame, and even though they are well funded, it kind of doesn't go far when you're creating a new work, and they have to be churning them out. If this production was created by a company like Vital Statistics that has, a very different model of creating, or, a company like Brink that, typically takes 5 years to develop a work, do you think that this production would go further with more development, or has it landed where it needs to land?
I think it is what it is. I see no reason to develop this piece further, but certainly to continue to support Elena's writing, and to encourage her to go to the next place.
Well, I mean, I would answer yes to what you've just asked, Ed. I think I would like to have seen it at a more developed stage. And I think one thing that I don't understand is why state theatre continue to put on new work that doesn't have a dramaturg attached to it. This was the problem with Hibernation, Finnegan Krukemeier's play, which I was really disappointed by, and I think it had huge structural and dramaturgical issues. And in many other states of Australia, I think it's standard practice that one, if not two dramaturgs in some cases, I see in productions in Melbourne, engage dramaturgs. And so I don't understand why it's not standard practice at state theatre. Ed might go to your point about perhaps a lack of resources, or that they don't feel the resources are best expended in that way. But for me, I see a real kind of hole in the kind of creative team around these kinds of works when there's not someone in that position working on them.
Yeah, I agree with you. And just for the record, I would have been wonderful to have one of the women play the male parts in that. I agree. That's a directing decision, not a script issue.
Yeah.
But if you knew you could use the ensemble in a variety of ways, it might change the whole development process.
Yeah, I think I don't know about dramaturgy and all that. I think I'm still trying to reconcile my understanding of its use, and that's just me just not being in this world heaps. We should have a bell every time you bring up dramaturgy. It's, and I want to talk more about it.
Panic of the Discourse bingo.
yeah, a sound effect. But I was talking to Ed about this play and how, in comparison with other sort of feminist theatre, like, for example, Eliza Oliver did How to Kill Your Hamster, and that is sort of like, it's its own thing. It's the age of the playwright, you can tell, the age of the actors. It's not trying to sort of adapt anything from the past at all. It's fresh, it's new. I don't think it had a I think someone said, it needed a dramaturgy thing. I think for me, I was like, it was just a delightful 90 minutes, whatever it was. It was like made for me. No old fogey. You can kind of tell some person in the thing was a boomer, person. And I'm not trying to be ageist at all. But I think that people have those traditions in theatre that they just cling on to instead of just relinquishing it. And I like seeing new theatre where I'm like, ooh, this is every aspect and element of it is fresh. Nothing is stuck in an old way of doing something.
Edwin, you mentioned Vital Statistics, another South Australian-based theatre company, often making experimental and feminist work. And, I would have been interested to see a work like this kind of go through, in a way, the machinery of something like Vitals, because I felt like there was a sort of tension in this work between kind of a more experimental kind of what once might have been called live art mode of theatre making, as against a more kind of conventional playwriting form that I think a lot of the scenes took. And I have to say, I think Elena's strength is in that more conventional kind of playwriting, kind of main stage playwriting, which I think she does extremely well. And to me, I think that was kind of, it wasn't very satisfactorily rubbing up against some of the kind of more experimental aspects of this work.
I don't have any problem, I think we can like many different things. We can appreciate many different genres and forms. So I'm fine with it the way it is, and good on her, them. I just don't know that I want to talk about it anymore.
Which is also appropriate for the time that we're at. I think it's good to go through final thoughts.
Final thoughts.
Yeah, I haven't found my final thoughts yet, except, no.
So, Ben, do you have any final thoughts? Like, I'm interested to know that, I know you said structurally and, dramaturgically there were things lacking, but I wonder if there are some standout things or aspects of the piece that you'd like to share.
I mean, I think I've already mentioned aspects of Elena's writing, which I think are really, really good. And I think as kind of standalone pieces of stage writing, I think some of the monologues in particular, and some of the duologues as well, I think are really, really great. And we haven't really said that much about the ensemble, and I think we should, because I think the ensemble is really good. And I don't know if this is my ignorance, but for me, Catherine Adams' performance in particular felt like a bit of a breakout. I think she's still relatively fresh out of drama school.
She's a singer. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I thought she was really, really good. And, that goes for the whole cast, but I thought there was something, I just felt like this might be a bit of a breakout role for her, and I hope it is, because I think she seems to be enormously talented.
It was a wonderful moment, wasn't it? It was such a surprise.
It was such a surprise. Yeah. And I'm sure that there's going to be a whole generation of, women trying to get into kind of drama school using that as an audition piece. So I would want to do it, I think, because I think it was so great. In terms of final thoughts, I was going to ask about the ending. I mean, there's this kind of very ironic, very kind of postmodern moment where this kind of Disney princess appears and sings this song. And again, I felt like I was suddenly being pulled in another direction that I didn't expect. So I don't know how comfortable I was with it, but I felt frustrated in the end by, what kind of happens is that there's this kind of dump of play texts on the stage. They kind of fall out of the fly as copies of Antigone. And there's this whole kind of very sort of post-structuralist debate about re-envisioning classic texts, through a feminist lens, etc., etc. And again, I just felt like we've been making work that's been saying this and doing this for 15, 20, 25 years now, because the play kind of finishes on this kind of blank slate moment. If you remember, it goes dark and they're all kind of looking out into this kind of, what would you call it? This kind of post male dominated canon landscape. But I just want to kind of see that work being made. I don't think we need, do you know what I mean? I think we can really kind of, I don't know personally, and again, this might be a lived experience question, but I feel like we are at this point where I think we can safely and confidently and boldly go and re-envisage these texts. And I'm not sure that I don't know that in itself is as radical a move as that ending seems to be suggesting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that comes down to who you think it's for. So I was talking to someone who said she was a woman and said that if she'd seen this in year 10, like that would have been, imagine being a 15-year-old girl and going to see that. And you all remember that as a woman, the young things that made you think and questioned, and I think it's about what stage we're at. And I think you're coming at it from someone who's well-versed and thought about it for decades probably at this point, and
not that up, Jules.
decades and decades. I mean, really. But yeah, and I think maybe it doesn't do a lot for you, but it's that thing of like, it's not going to serve everyone. Yeah. But I think what it does do for like people who aren't in this world and in this homogenous way of thinking of like, well, of course we're all feminists because of XYZ. I think it is provocative. Asked questions makes them go home and think about their relationship to gender and sex and all of that. That's all.
I'm very grateful to Elena, the cast, and to Mitchell, who's the artistic director of the State Theatre Company, because I think he's quite open to new and interesting ideas, it seems. I hope his tenure lasts longer than this COVID-created gap that he's been working in for this while.
I would agree, and I think it's really great to see State Theatre continuing to invest in new stories and ones that are not necessarily conventional in form or content. And I think that speaks very well to Mitchell and his embrace of innovation and pushing forwards. And I think all of that is good. And I always say I would much rather see an ambitious or bold failure, quote unquote, than a kind of safe, boring success. I think we all know what those kinds of plays look like, and to me, they're the least interesting thing that theatre can do.
I want to squeeze one last thing in because I think it's profound in a way that probably means not much to you, maybe to you, but to have not such an Aryan cast as well, and to have most of the cast be women and have some diversity even within that whiteness was profound for me to see, because there was, even 10 years ago, there was just no way to break into state theatre. I think Chiara Gabrielli was like one of the first women of spicy white colour to be like burst through on the leading Gorgon with Jim Smith. So I think we shouldn't take that for granted, because state theatre is like decades behind, I feel like, in representation.
And Elena as well, you'd have to say, is a trailblazer in that sense, because and because she's of an older generation, and I know that she's come up against all of those blocks in her professional career. I think a spicy white woman is probably the right way of putting that as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Jules and Ben and PJ for the discussion.
Thank you, PJ, Ben, and Ed.
I'll just add as well that one of the things that we really want to get through this project is feedback from people that are watching it or listening to it. So anyone that is, please give us feedback either directly to us or subscribe to the podcast or subscribe to the YouTube channel, leave a 5-star review or a comment. Those things actually make a huge impact in the ability of this project to reach other people. It's great for us to get that kind of feedback. And thank you. Next episode, we're going to be reviewing National Theatre Live's production of A Midsummer Night's Dream.
Even though no one of us saw it live.
Correct.
The wonders of the 21st century.
Ill met by moonlight, proud Titania.
What thou seest when thou dost wake, do it for thy true love take.
Is all our company here? You, Nick Bottom, are set down for Pyramus.
Yes! You canker blossom! You thief of love!
Mine ear is much enamoured of thy note. I love thee.